Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Garjuk with UATV. Just recently, Germany has celebrated one of the most iconic days in its modern history. 27 years ago, East and West Germany reunited after the Berlin Wall fell. The history repeats itself. Nowadays, we've got another wall between independent Ukraine and occupied territories of Donbass and Crimea. About the ways how Kyiv can handle this situation and if Ukraine should take a closer look at the Germany's experience, we are joined via Skype by Alexander Motyl. He is a political scientist and American historian of Ukrainian origin. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, Mr. Motyl, how Ukraine could learn from German experience?
Well, very simply, back in 1949, after the German Federal Republic had been created and Konrad Adenauer was the Chancellor of Germany, he understood that the choice before Germany was difficult, but at the same time simple. The question was, should he strive to reunite the Federal Republic with the occupied territories in East Germany, or should he try to build a strong, democratic, and prosperous state in West Germany? He understood that if he was going to pursue the first option, reunification, that would mean having to do so on Soviet terms, and that would mean that the resulting state would likely be Soviet-oriented, non-democratic, and not Western, pro-Western. And he understood that given that kind of choice, the only rational approach that Germany could make under those circumstances was to opt for the second choice. That is to say, focus on West Germany, make it into a strong, democratic, prosperous, Western state, and then worry about reunification later on.
So, does this mean that Adenauer's scenario would work actually in Ukraine, even in war situation?
Well, the bottom line is, just as Adenauer, I think, effectively understood that he had no alternative. To opt for reunification on Stalin's terms was simply a non-starter. And by the same token, for Ukraine to opt for reunification on Putin's terms is effectively a non-starter. It simply isn't going to work. And there is no alternative to Putin's scenario. It's not as if there is a whole range of options that Ukraine can pursue. Ukraine cannot reconquer these territories militarily. It's not strong enough to do so. And if it tried to do so, it would unleash a major land war with the Russian Federation. And no one wants that. And effectively, the question is, should Ukraine appreciate and understand that these territories are occupied? And I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. They're occupied. There's not much you can do about the fact that they are indeed occupied, both by the local militants and, of course, by the Russian Federation. So the choice between Ukraine is either accepting and living with that reality or pretending that that isn't a reality. Well, again, one can pretend, but that would seem to be an unrealistic way to craft a foreign policy. So if you accept that reality, then the only choice you have is to live with it. And, the solution that Adenauer suggests is living with it isn't the worst possible thing. One can build up a strong country in the time that one has, build up a strong democracy, and then 5, 10, 15 years from now, depending on circumstances, things may change, conditions may change, those territories may want to return, Russia may decide to withdraw, who knows? But in the meantime, why waste time worrying about reunification when Ukraine should be spending that time worrying about democracy, prosperity, and a strong economy at home?
But if we give up these territories, wouldn't it mean for Russia that we would also give up some other territories that they would like to occupy, for example?
Adenauer never gave up East Germany.
Hmm. That's interesting.
And I'm not suggesting that Ukraine formally say we give up. I'm simply saying that it should follow his advice and say, well, for the time being, we don't control these territories anyway. That's just a reality.
Hmm.
So let's simply focus on what we can do, which is to say, let's focus on the 95% of Ukraine that we do control and try to institute the reforms that we can. By the way, I mean, one of the points that is very important, at least, and this is one of the points of difference between Ukraine and Germany, is that Ukraine at present is far more capable of embarking upon effective reforms. And we've seen that in the last 3 years. It is far more capable of doing that precisely because both Crimea and the eastern Donbass are not part of the political system. These are the regions that were always producing the oligarchs, the criminal elements, and a population that was always opposed to pro-Western reforms of any kind.
Hmm.
In essence, by occupying these territories, Vladimir Putin has removed their influence on Ukrainian politics, on Ukrainian economics, on Ukrainian society and culture. And he has made it significantly easier for Ukraine to pursue reform. Imagine, just for the sake of argument, that tomorrow both territories were suddenly to be reintegrated into Ukraine, bloodlessly, without any problems. That would mean that the Party of Regions would return, organized crime would be back, the oligarchs would be stronger, and suddenly several million people who had always voted for pro-Soviet, pro-Russian, and anti-Western agendas would be voting for those same agendas. That would make the reform process, which is difficult anyway, almost impossible, and reforms in Ukraine would effectively end. And
So,
hopes for continued reforms would effectively be nullified. So Ukraine has this ideal moment. It is now far more capable of reform, and all it has to do is take advantage of this ideal moment, embark on reforms, continue to implement reforms, and then worry about reintegration later on. But as I said, I'm not suggesting that Ukraine formally abandon these territories. No, I'm saying don't worry about them. There's things to be done in Ukraine proper. And if the living standards of the democracy, if society, if culture can be raised to appropriate levels in Ukraine, that will then serve as the most powerful magnet for the populations in Crimea and the Donbass,
mhm.
because the condition, economically and politically, will only get worse. It
and
will not improve.
And what you mean is that the first step for Ukrainian government would to recognize officially that the territories are occupied, right?
Well, that's a
Yeah.
problematic issue, as I understand, because if you claim that they're occupied, then you have to specify who the occupant is, and if Russia is the occupier, then in principle it's in a state of war, and no one wants to do that. So that's a touchy issue.
Actually, the bill about reintegration of Donbass into Ukraine was introduced today in Ukrainian parliament. Have you heard about it, and what do you think about it? Because in that bill, Ukraine recognized Donbass as the occupied territory and Russia as the aggressor.
Well, again, I've heard about the bill. I haven't read the bill. Um, Personally, again, if that's the solution they found, I mean, and if the Ukrainian government doesn't fear that this necessarily entails creating a condition of war with Russia, then that's fine with me. I'll trust them on this particular point. The ideal situation, from my point of view, would be for the conflict to be frozen and for United Nations peacekeepers to be arrayed along the line of demarcation. And that way, Ukrainian soldiers would stop dying, Ukrainian civilians would stop dying, and the situation would be frozen. And the frozen situation, from Ukraine's point of view, is strategically the most advantageous. For in the meantime, Russia has to bear all the costs of the Donbass and Crimea. And at the same time, if the war were to stop, soldiers and civilians would stop dying, which would be a wonderful thing. And at the same time, Ukraine could concentrate its efforts on reform.
If I'm not mistaken, Germany could get the reunification because the Soviet Union collapsed. And does this mean that Ukraine would get the territories back only if Russian Empire collapses also?
That's perfectly possible, by the way. I mean, Ukraine has to accept the reality.
So
Russia
basically, you do not believe that right now we can get these territories back?
If someone could tell me how that's supposed to happen, I would say, well, let's talk about it. But the only solutions that people are suggesting are military solutions. They're talking about the Croatian scenario, but that's nonsense. Ukraine's army will not be able to retake these territories militarily without provoking a major war with Russia. Russia has an army of 750,000 troops. It has nuclear weapons. It has a sophisticated air force. Ukraine is in no position to fight a major land war with Russia. And again, it would be the height of stupidity for Ukraine to do this. And so not only would it not get the territories back, but it's likely to lose the war and lose half of Ukraine in the process. So that's just not an option. I just don't see how one can talk about that. Alternatively, Russia isn't going to give these territories back out of its own goodwill without demanding some quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo that Russia is demanding is that the militants remain in power. Essentially, that's the deal, which means that they would become a Trojan horse within the Ukrainian body politic and prevent continued reforms, continued movement towards the West. That's too high a price to pay. It's far better that 90% or 95% of Ukraine become democratic and prosperous and Western than for 100% of Ukraine to become a vassal of Russia. To my mind, that's just such an obvious choice. And that is precisely the choice that Adenauer faced. And he understood that it's a difficult choice. It's not a choice that one wants to make, that there was no alternative to opting for the West.
So how do you think, what could be the further steps for Ukraine to implement this Adenauer scenario? More working on the reforms, right?
Well, the first step is to stabilize the front. It's extremely important for the United Nations peacekeepers to be placed along the line of demarcation. That's the key. Putin has agreed to this, and Ukraine should take him on his word and test him. That works to Ukraine's advantage because it freezes the conflict, imposes all of the costs for maintaining the eastern Donbass on Russia, and then permits Ukraine to focus on its own internal reforms. So, freeze the conflict, point number one. If necessary, set up some kind of demilitarized zone. I mean, there are all sorts of options for that. And then focus on reforms.
Mr. Motyl, thank you for this conversation.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
That was Alexander Motyl, a political scientist and American historian of Ukrainian origin. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Alexander Motyl. Goodbye.